Hi all. Okay, so we're going to talk about instrument design and classification first. I'm going to show you up close here what I usually draw on the board in the dental materials lab for clinic. So we have got periodontal instruments over here. And so this is what we've been learning about so far. There are different kinds and types, and that's what instrument design and classification means. Like certain things are made to do certain things. And so what you all have learned so far is assessment instruments, where we've got the Explorer that you practiced and the periodontal probe. And so with these types of instruments, we are not treating, we are assessing, or we are looking for the things, trying to figure out what this person has going on at this point in time. But then our other type of periodontal instrument are calculus removal instruments or treatment instruments, where we are doing treatment. We have found the things with the assessment instruments, and now we are doing something about it with the treatment instruments. So you've got sickle scalers, curettes, and then a periodontal file. So that's the difference between those two sets of instruments. And then right here, we've got like a blown up version of an instrument where we have got labeled the top is the face. So this is the very end of that blade. You have the two lateral sides. And so then where the lateral sides meet the face, that makes cutting edges on each side of this one in particular. And then you have the back. Then for curettes and sickles, we're going to learn about those as well. Your curette is going to have a cross section that's more rounded on the bottom, flat on the top, and then it's going to have a toe at the end of that face. Whereas a sickle is going to be more triangular in cross section, and then that face is going to meet with a tip at the end. When we are naming instruments and trying to decide, so we talked about how it can either be the person who invented the instrument, like a Gracie, or it can go by numbers. And so for this one in particular, if it's a 1, 2, the end that is the 1 is the end that is closest to the 1. And then the end that's a 2 is the end that is closest to the 2. Then, let's see here, what you've talked about already with Explorers is a functional shank and a terminal shank. So we've got a long shank here, but then this terminal shank is quite often what we're worried about whenever we're trying to use the correct working end, but then also adapt correctly. So you're going to hear us say a lot about this terminal shank, and it's just that little portion of the shank before you get to the working blade part. And then we're going to divide the tooth just like we have been with exploring and probing. You're going to start on that distal line angle and scale in, come out, and then go across the front and then scale into the mesial. What I do want to call your attention to with this one is we don't do walking strokes anymore with scaling instruments. We are going to insert appropriately, adapt, and then scale, but we don't walk with these. Okay, so then for design and classification, there are different things you need to know about the handles. And so what is recommended is a large diameter handle, easier to grasp, as opposed to a thin handle. So this is an ergonomic thing that we've touched on a little bit previously, but this is a thick one, this is a thin one, and recommended would be a large handle. One that is lightweight is also recommended. And then also, let's see, this texturing is on here for a reason too. These little grips are to help it remain in your hand and not like slide out, so you don't have to use so much pressure with your fingers to keep control of the instrument. What is not recommended at this point is something like this one, where it has a small diameter, it's more heavy and solid in this handle, and then there's not as much texturing. See the difference in the texture? So the one has big texture marks, And the other one, they're much smaller. They're not helping with a lot of that grip. You want the balance of the working ends, meaning it's balanced on each end. It's even whenever you're holding it. An example of something I can think of that's not balanced would be a mirror, because you've got the one heavy end, whereas this one's even. Shank design, so we can have a simple or a complex shank. So an example here would be something like this, where this one is straight and it only bends in one plane. So straight up, bends once. So that is a simple shank. Simple shanks are typically used for anterior teeth, because if you think about it, you know, some of this, I like this part because you don't necessarily have to know the names of everything, but you can look at these instruments and kind of decide where and how it should be used. And so if you think about it, a simple shank is not going to go over all those big parts of molars. It's not made to reach into deep pockets. It's made to get something easy, like a tooth in the front of the mouth. Whereas a complex shank, so see the difference here, has a lot of bends and curves in it. It is bent in more than one plane. And so when you look at this, it's made to get around big parts of teeth and to fit into places. So you would think that it would potentially go to the posterior or toward the back of the mouth so that it can fit around some of those areas where the simple one could not. As far as shank flexibility, let me show you the difference here. So we've got a shank with our assessment instruments, our Explorer, that is very thin. So by looking at this, you would not think that you would be using a lot of lateral pressure because it is so thin. You're not going to be pressing hard. It's not going to do anything. Whereas with this one, you've got a thick shank. So you could automatically look at these two instruments and think, this one is a treatment instrument and this one is an assessment instrument, just because of the base of that shank right there. A rigid shank is going to remove heavier deposit with less effort. And then the flexible one, like an Explorer, is going to provide more tactile sensitivity so that you're feeling for things, not removing them. Let's see here. So a functional shank, this whole thing right here, the whole thing right here is a functional shank. So this is why you can get around the tooth and adapt to the areas you need to, like around the tooth, deep in the pocket. That's what a functional shank is for. A short one is going to be for supragingival calculus removal. And so that makes sense, right? It doesn't have to go deep down into a pocket. So let me show you the difference, you know, between one that's going to be longer. So a longer functional shank is going to be made to fit back further and fit down deeper into pockets. Let's see. And then with the lower or the terminal shank, this one gives a good example of a longer terminal shank. So that terminal shank is the portion right here that we were talking about before you get to that blade or that working end. And so it's nearest to the working end. It's going to help you select the correct working end, just like we did with the Explorer. It's pretty similar to that. You're going to want this terminal shank parallel to the long axis of the tooth. And then there are some extended shanks where it's just longer. And so I'm going to get an example here for you. See where one of these terminal shanks is longer than the other one. Let's see if you can see that difference there. So the longer one, just by looking at it, you would think, okay, this is made to go down into a deeper pocket than this other one is. In your manual, there is a page about shank design. It's page 194. And it has differences for you between the simple and the short, which would be supra and anterior, the simple and the long, which would be sub and anterior, a complex and a short, which would be supra and posterior, and then a complex and a long, which would be sub and posterior. And so it's just one of those things where you have to think about it. How far back in the mouth are you wanting to go? If it's further back in the mouth, it's going to be more complex. If you are wanting to go into deeper pockets, then it's going to be a longer shank. Whereas toward the front of the mouth, it's going to be a more simple and straight shank. With instrument design and classification, what I want you to practice is taking the instruments out of your cassette and mixing them up. And so what part of your practice is going to be with this portion is mixing them up and then trying to separate them yourself. And so what you're going to try and do is separate it to where you have a pile of assessment instruments, a pile of sickle scalers. So the sickle scaler is the one, or the few, where you've got that tip or that pointed in. So that clues you in on if that is a sickle scaler or not. Then separate your curettes out. And so your curettes don't have that tip when you look at them. They're going to have a toe or a rounded end. So I want you to take the time to mix them up and then line them out appropriately. And so then I want you to pause this because I'm going to tell you what you need to look for. So pause it while you practice. And then when you come back, and if you need help, what you're going to have is, for assessment instruments, you're going to have your neighbor's probe, your UNC probe, a mirror, and an explorer for your assessment instrument pile. Then you're going to have a sickle scaler pile that's going to have 3 instruments in it. There's going to be the SN137M7. That's this one right here. And so what are we guessing? Anterior or posterior with that? Like, talk to yourself and think through these things. This one's going to be anterior. You're going to have a Nevi 2. That's what we call this one in here. And so it's got this point on the end. And so the difference between these two, what do you think? Anterior or posterior? You know, this one's going to be posterior because it's got more curves. And then you're going to have a 204S. This is one I feel like is very common in offices. And so you're going to see this one a decent amount. We like this one here, and we like for you to get used to it because of offices. I feel like the reason we like the Nevi 2 here, you're not going to see this one as often, but you're going to hear us say things like, we like it because it goes really far interproximally, or it can reach further into those interproximals than the 204S can. And then I also want to say, as far as sickles or supragingival instruments, because think about it logically. These have a point, so we're going to use them above the tissue. That's your textbook answer, is supragingival. But then what I also want to say is real world things here. And so then all of us are going to tell you too, in the real world, we sneak that sickle scaler a little bit underneath the tissue. We are very careful about adapting, but there are definitely many of us in here who will say that we use it just a little bit underneath that gingival tissue in the real world. So keep in mind the distinction here. That's not your textbook answer. That's your real life answer. So then you're going to have a pile with 2 universals. And so this is where it gets a little tricky. You're going to have your 2 posterior universals. So they've got more curves. It's going to be the 7-8 and the 5-6. But then you're also going to have that additional anterior sickle, because you've got a sickle on one end, but you've got your anterior universal on the other end. So this instrument right here is a sickle on one end and a universal on the other, meaning you have an unpaired instrument. It is not the mirror image or the same thing on both sides. It is unpaired, but it's your anterior instrument. And then you're gonna have Gracies. And so we're gonna talk about these in a few weeks, but your Gracies are also curettes. And so you're gonna have a 1-2, which is this one right here. So are you thinking anterior or posterior with this? You know, we're bent in one plane, so anterior. And this compared to these two, where they're bent in several planes. So already we're thinking complex. This is going to be posterior. And then I see a long terminal shank. Chances are this is going to be sub. It's a curette. So yes, that's what's going to happen. So these are your 13-14 and your 15-16. So those are your curettes, your Gracie curettes, whenever you are determining what is what in your cassette.